Incredibly, this is our 300th episode of the Old Frontline podcast. What started in the middle of a time when world events changed all our lives and was something I thought might begin and end that year, it's now 6 years old, has had millions of downloads, and now we've reached 300 episodes. As always at these milestones, I want to pause and thank you all for listening. You've helped make the podcast what it's become. And I want to thank, too, those who help support the podcast financially via Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. The podcast is free, and it always will be. And we've managed 10 seasons now without adverts. And that's thanks to those who pitch in and help with the costs of keeping the podcast online and moving forward. And I'm so grateful. But more than this, what I realise it's done for me is help shape and change the way I look at and think about the Great War and that wider landscape of the old front line. It's made me pause and consider the culture of the old front line, what it means to us, how that meaning changes, and contemplate how future generations might see it too. It's made me look back on all those hundreds of Great War veterans that I knew and were privileged to interview about their experiences and bring some of their stories to you. And there's more of that to come, I hope. And the Q&A, the question and answer episodes, regularly challenge me. And I love that. And your questions are just simply amazing and have taken us down all kinds of avenues connected to some of the lesser known aspects of First World War history. As well, I'm truly humbled at the hundreds of emails that I get each month where you contact me to say what the Old Frontline podcast means to you, what the battlefields mean to you, tell me about your own connection to the Great War, your own travels across that landscape, inform me that the podcast in many cases has inspired you to make your own journey to that landscape of the past, and so much more. And again, long may all that continue. I'm proud of the podcast, proud of what it's become, and proud too that through it we've been able to highlight so much about the things that really matter, the history, the stories, the lives and deaths of so many, to remember them as we should, and perhaps view that landscape not just through the prism of war diaries and official histories, but through the voices of ordinary men and women, extraordinary men and women really, but also through birdsong, nature, and all those other layers that we find there. But our song here is not yet sung. Even after 300 episodes, there's still so much to say and do, so much to discover together, and so much to continue to highlight. And the Old Front Line isn't going anywhere. At least I hope so. So to mark this 300th episode, we'll go back to where we started, with a walk at Pozieres, something we did in episode 1 in March 2020, and reflect on what has happened there and how we discuss that landscape and what has changed in those 6 years since we first trod that Somme path together. So where are we? We're going to begin this virtual walk as we did all those years ago at the Pozieres British Cemetery and the Pozières Memorial to the Missing. We're standing as such on the Albert-Bapaume road, with Albert behind us in the distance. We might catch the sunshine on the Basilica, the golden figure of Mary with her outstretched arms holding the infant Jesus in the very centre of the town. And from the rising ground here on the Pozieres Ridge, we can often see it on days like this. Ahead of us, the road continues through the next village, the village of Pozieres, and goes all the way to Bapaume, at the end of this old Roman road. And this road cuts right through the heart of those 1916 battles. The pivotal moments of that summer of 1916, as it moved towards autumn and then winter, happened in the villages and the ridges and the woods either side of this old Roman road. It dominates this battlefield in so many different ways. And standing here we can see the tall columns of a wall, and above the mighty archway a coffin, an empty coffin, a cenotaph almost, with steel helmets and rifles and battle gear. And we know we're at a memorial from the First World War. And looking through the gaps in those mighty columns as if this was a temple, we can see rows and rows of white Portland stone headstones, typical of the soldiers' cemeteries that mark this landscape of 1916. And standing at the gate and going through those vast bronze gates that mark this entranceway, we're coming into Pozieres British Cemetery. This was a small battlefield cemetery initially, made in 1917, and then graves from the surrounding battlefields were moved in here. It was made permanent with a small cross of sacrifice, and then due to a number of circumstances, it was then designated a main concentration cemetery and the site for the Pozieres Memorial to the missing, of which more shortly. Today there's 2,760 burials here at Pozieres British Cemetery, of which 1,382 are unidentified, and nearly half of all of the burials in here, it's very, very noticeable when you walk in, half of them are Australian or Canadian, reflecting the fighting for Pozieres village by the Australians, by the Australian Imperial Force, and the battles beyond Pozieres to the next village of Courcelette, where the Canadian Corps went into action for the first time as a corps in an attack on the 15th of September 1916. So when we look at the cap badges on the headstones, we can see the rising sun of the Australian Imperial Force badge and the maple leaf for Canada very much dominating this cemetery as we walk round, but lots of British badges too, because regiment after regiment before the Australians made their attack on Pozieres fought in the approach from Albert, from Mash Valley, which is just down from where we're standing now, back towards the neighbouring village of Overlers, which we discussed in some recent podcasts about the early phase of the Battle of the Somme. And once they were captured, that ground there, the valley and the village, the fighting moved towards Pozieres, and men from many different battalions and units fought here, which again is reflected in the burials. The early photographs of the cemetery show a lot of unit, particularly Australian unit memorials within the confines of the cemetery, those now removed, many of them taken back to Australia after the Great War. There was also a plot near to where you first go in, where there's a lot of 1917 burials, where there was a kind of holding area for wooden crosses. It's not clear from the contemporary images whether those are crosses from this cemetery or from a wider area. In many cases, a lot of these crosses got burnt because families could apply for them after the war, but that wasn't generally known. So the vast majority of these wooden crosses were eventually destroyed. The metal features on them could not be destroyed by fire, and occasionally you find these metal strips with names and numbers and units and dates on in battlefield areas close to where some of the cemeteries are. The memorial that surrounds the burials, the walls essentially of this site, are the Pozieres Memorial to the Missing, that commemorate those who fell on the Somme from the 21st of March 1918, the first day of the German offensive, the Kaiserschlacht, when the Germans attacked in that southern part of the British front with an attempt to break through the British lines and force a wedge between the British and the French. And the memorial continues to commemorate men up to the August 1918 period, when the Vis-en-Artois Memorial near Arras takes over and commemorates those who fell from the 8th of August 1918, including on the Somme in that Battle of Amiens, through to the final day of the Great War on the Western Front, the 11th of November 1918. So this is an important cemetery and memorial, a cemetery largely from the 1916 Battle of the Somme, and a memorial that records some of the fighting here 2 years later. Both cemetery and memorial was designed by William Harrison Collishaw, who was one of the architects of the Imperial War Graves Commission. He was too old to fight in the Great War. He was born in 1869, and prior to 1914 became famous for a building called the Cloisters in Letchworth. He's not as famous as Lutyens and the other architects, but he built and designed several really key First World War cemetery sites, obviously including this one here. And I think that kind of cenotaph-style gateway entrance, which takes you from the modern world into the world of the past, where the graves and the names are, is an important feature of this site. And you can walk round the edges of the cemetery and then go up the steps onto the higher level of the memorial to see panel after panel. And like all memorials to the missing, this is in regimental order. So it starts with senior officers at one end, and there's a brigadier general on here who died in the March 1918 offensive, whose body was never recovered, never found, through to the cavalry regiments, the artillery, the engineers, through to the infantry units. And there's also South African names on here. The South African Brigade, part of the 9th Scottish Division, was pushed back in March 1918 and fought some pretty costly actions between Peronne and Bapaume during that period, and many of their dead are found on the walls of the memorial here. The memorial to the missing, like all of those that we will visit, and we're beginning with one here and we're going to end with another one too, which from the back of the cemetery or the side of the cemetery we can see in the distance, and of course that's the Thiepval Memorial to the missing. These memorials to the missing are part of the ever-present sadness of the Great War. These are men who in previous conflicts would never have been commemorated, but as this war had touched every family in the land and gone across all class and social backgrounds, and Kipling, who was on the committee of the Imperial War Graves Commission, his own son was missing. He felt that it was important, as did many others, that the missing of that war was somehow commemorated. And that became, with names carved in stone, what we see on memorial sites like this one. But it's, I guess, the missing are part of the legacy of the First World War, which still resonates down the years, because the missing are still being found. When I was over on the Somme last week for the 110th anniversary, they were preparing for several military funerals in the area of the battlefields. We went to film at Wallencourt British Cemetery, the first one you come to as you come into the Somme area, and they were preparing for a burial there for some soldiers that were found in the area where the wind farms have been constructed on the Somme in recent years. And then a few days later they were down near Villers-Bretonneux to bury some British and Commonwealth soldiers found in that area, and the British soldiers who may have been amongst them, their names will be recorded here at Pozieres, whoever they were. In that case, I don't think any of them were identified. But the very fact that soldiers' remains are still being found shows that once more the pages of this history continue to turn. There are so many names on this memorial. Where do you begin? We could spend podcast after podcast talking about some of the stories here. And in that very first one, when we came here together for the first time, I spoke about Lieutenant Colonel Wilfrid Elstob, VC DSOMC of the Manchester Regiment, a man that went from private soldier to Lieutenant Colonel, commanded his Manchester Powers Battalion, and was killed on Manchester Hill near to Saint-Quentin in the March 1918 battles. And when you read his fighting citation, it really kind of typifies what British soldiers were up against, really, in that March 1918 period, with overwhelming German troops assaulting their positions, and really they either fought to the last or surrender. Elstob fought to the last. His body was never found, and his name is found here. But with all missing soldiers, and I have photographs and memorial plaques and medals to quite a few men who are commemorated on the Pozieres Memorial. And on one level, you could just come here and touch that name, see that name on the panels, and that's it. But what I always like to do is find out exactly where they died, the circumstances of their death, and then go and visit those places too. So with Elstob, it's not just about seeing his name here on the Pozieres Memorial. It's about standing on that sloping ground of Manchester Hill, looking towards the Cathedral of Saint-Quentin, still there after all these years, battle damaged in the Great War, but it survived. And you're looking across that almost kind of eternal landscape, now cut by motorways. There's a bit of the modern world always intrudes somewhere, but it's a powerful place to go to know that you've seen a name carved in stone, but you're standing on the ground where perhaps that soldier may still lie buried. And one day, just like those reburials I saw last week, perhaps these men will be brought in from the cold. I always go to the Royal Sussex panels when I come to a place like this. I'm from Sussex. I mean, I've spoken about that so many times in these 6 years and 300 episodes. But there's a lad commemorated on here from my hometown, Crawley, Major Joseph John Banham, 9th Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment, who was killed on the 27th of March 1918, aged 31. He lived in a street in Crawley called Malthouse Road, which was not far from the railway station, one of the older streets in what, for me, growing up there, was a new town. But amongst that new town were bits of the old world, with the War Memorial Gardens, with these black plaques with gold lettering that listed all of the local men who'd fallen in the Great War. And his being an unusual name in the days long before the internet, when it was much more tricky to research soldiers, his was one of the first I ever looked up, and his was one of the first names I ever came to find here on the battlefields to trace those Crawley men. And I think having these kind of personal connections to places like this means that you always have something to see, to connect with, to come and find whenever you revisit. And for me, of course, over many, many years of bringing groups to places like this is something that I've had the privilege to do on a regular basis. Leaving the Pozieres Memorial and Cemetery behind, we go out onto the main road and we walk towards Pozieres village, and very quickly come across another memorial, not as grand, not as big. It's a unit memorial, a regimental memorial, the King's Royal Rifle Corps Memorial, just to the right of the main road, in, again, the sloping ground as we approach towards the crest of this Pozieres ridge. And it's a duplicate of the one that is on the Menin Road at Ypres, close to Hooge, which commemorates the King's Royal Rifle Corps battalions that fought there at Ypres during all 4 years of the Great War. This one reads, "To the memory of officers and men who gave their lives on the battlefields of France in the cause of liberty and justice." And I think that the meaning of that phrase, in the cause of liberty and justice, is something that's kind of got forgotten, really, about the men who fought in the Great War. They saw the threat of Imperial Germany and Kaiser Wilhelm just as strongly as a generation later their children would see Adolf Hitler as a threat, and for them this was a fight for liberty and justice, to defeat a bully within Europe and a country that threatened their way of life. And I think the Great War, one of the challenges of the Great War, bringing new people to this subject, is getting them to understand that the threat of Germany within Europe to Britain and its population was just as vivid, just as strong as it was 2 decades later. But when we look at the units, and the battalions are listed on here, there's 13 battalions from the King's Royal Rifle Corps that fought on the Somme in 1916. It shows what a big regiment it was. It's got one of the largest number of battle honours, for example. But when I look at the list, a couple will always jump out at me. The 16th Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, they were the Church Lads Brigade. A lot of the original members of the battalion were from the Church Lads Brigade, a pre-war civilian organisation, and it fought its first action in July 1916 as a battalion, having served at the Quincy Brickstacks and up round Gavinci before that. At High Wood, it went into action in an attack on High Wood that costed a lot of casualties in July 1916. But also on there is the 21st Battalion King's Royal Rifle Corps. That was the Yeoman Rifles. Now, that's a battalion that had always interested me, a kind of farmers' pals battalion formed by the Earl Feversham, big Yorkshire landowner. And when I lived up in Yorkshire, I went up into his world, his landscape of North Yorkshire. I saw the original marker from his grave that was once at Fleurs, having visited his grave at AIF Burial Ground many, many times. I've told the story of the Colonel's Field on this podcast before, and if that's something you're not familiar with, go back and find that episode, and I think you'll find it of interest. Anthony Eden served with the battalion, future Prime Minister, and he writes about it in his memoirs. And going back to connections, it's one of those units that has popped up in my research so many times over the years, and I found myself following them not just here on the Somme, but up in Flanders. They came down from Plug Street Wood before they fought at Fleurs, and then served up on the Messines Ridge, and indeed in so many other battles besides. And again, I think sometimes focusing on particular units, if you don't know how to kind of channel your research into this subject, because it's so vast, the Great War, picking a unit and finding out about what that unit was doing gives you a kind of segue into so many different layers of First World War history, and that's always good to do. And since we first walked this path together in 2020, there's been a lot of changes on this side of the Pozieres village. The fields just on this side were a place where I often used to see people wandering around picking up scrap back in the day. But lots of new build houses are going up in this area, and the ground around the memorial has just been sold. It's not protected land. Why would it be? I mean, these men fought so that France could be free, and the right of Frenchmen and women to do whatever they want here, it was all part of that victory. But that does mean, of course, we see changes, and I don't know what the changes around this memorial will be until those new houses are built. Continuing our journey, we come up to a part of the road where a smaller road goes off to the left, and we can see signs for memorial sites, and we can see quite a tall obelisk as well. And this is the area around the 1st Australian Division Memorial. Where the information panels are was the site of the Gibraltar Bunker, a massive German concrete bunker built not as a machine gun bunker or defensive bunker as such, but as an observation bunker, because going back to the fact that we're on the Pozieres Ridge with these fantastic views, if you go up onto the bank where the bunker was, even without the bunker being there, you can see an incredible distance across this landscape, back into Albert, beyond Albert on very clear days, and you can see why the Germans were keen to put up a structure, concrete structure like this, that gave them this kind of commanding view. It was named because it looked like the Rock of Gibraltar. Now, I've read in many books that it was because there were Hanoverian units fighting in the area, and the Hanoverian units, very often their lineage went back to the King's German Legion, which was a regiment of the British Army that had fought in the Napoleonic Wars, including alongside other British units in the defence of Gibraltar in the 1790s, and they had that Battle Honour of Gibraltar as a cuff title on the lower part of their cuff in yellow with the words Gibraltar on it. Now, there were Hanoverian units on the Somme, but not fighting here. This name Gibraltar most definitely goes back to the fact that this massive concrete structure looked like the Rock of Gibraltar. But whatever the reason, this was a bit of ground where the Australians fought in July of 1916. The original Australian Imperial Force formed into the 1st Australian Division, which had taken part in the landings at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. They were the original Anzacs with the New Zealanders alongside them. They formed the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, Anzac, and the beach there was Anzac Cove, and the whole sector was an Anzac, and they fought right through that Gallipoli campaign from the landings to evacuation, suffered tremendous casualties along the way. Other Australian units joined them. But the 1st Australian, after acclimatising to conditions on the Western Front up in northern France and on the border with Belgium, moved down to the Somme and captured Pozieres in a single day on the 23rd of July 1916. This was quite an incredible attack when the Australians moved forward and captured this high ground around the village and what was left of Pozieres itself. And there's so many different incredible episodes involving these Australians, these diggers who fought here in July of 1916. One, when I stand on this bit of ground, look back down the Albert Bapaume Road, that I always think of, is that field gun episode involving Lieutenant Samuel Thornhill. Now, Thornhill, like a lot of Australians, about a third of them, slightly less than the Canadians, about 70% of the Canadians were originally born in Britain, about a third of the Australians were. So Thornhill was born at Whalley Range at Manchester, and he'd emigrated to Australia before the Great War, joined the AIF in 1914 after Gallipoli, was commissioned into the 2nd Brigade Australian Field Artillery, and in the attack here on Pozieres, he pushed an 18-pounder field gun up onto the area close to the main road, and he fired 115 rounds from that gun in about 15 to 20 minutes straight down the road at targets that he could see that were causing the Australian infantry problems. So this gave a kind of new meaning to close support when it came to the artillery. Traditionally, artillery would be back, away from the battlefield, firing in support to the infantry, dropping shells onto an unseen enemy. In this battle, Thornhill brought his gun team up, and they used the gun as field guns had been used right at the very beginning of the Great War, firing over open sights on targets that they could see. Thurnier was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery in that action, but sadly he was killed on the Somme in November 1916, and you'll find his grave at Caterpillar Valley. Now, this site is dominated by the 1st Australian Division Memorial to those original Anzacs, but it was once going to be a memorial park in the 1920s, and we know this from a book called Where the Australians Rest, which was a book given to the families of all those Australians that died in the Great War, with information about the memorials and the cemeteries within it. It says in there that a memorial park was planned for Pozieres at that time, where there would be field guns, there would be the remains of the Gibraltar pillbox, there would be the Australian 1st Division Memorial. Perhaps some of those crosses that were down in Pozieres Cemetery would have been moved here. And I honestly don't know why it never happened, but it didn't happen. The 1st Australian Division Memorial was still built, but the Gibraltar pillbox was dynamited and blown apart, only uncovered in the 1990s when there was a dig on this site and a huge amount of material was pulled out, and it showed that the Gibraltar bunker had been built on top of an existing building, and that you access the bunker through the cellar of that building and up into the main bunker itself. And that's still on display today. If you go there, you will see it. So this could have been something very different. I mean, thousands of Australians come here every year, probably tens of thousands during the Great War centenary. Pozieres is a kind of byword for sacrifice on the Somme in 1916. It was a battle in which the Australians fought from the very capture of the village in July through to when they handed over the positions around Pozieres in September. So 2 months they were here, and in fighting in this small corner of northern France, they suffered almost as many casualties as they'd suffered at Gallipoli the previous year. And as the 2nd Australian Division, they joined them later on. Their memorial is up on the Pozieres windmill site. As that memorial states, Australians fell more thickly on this battlefield than any other of the war. And it took a long time, I think, for the importance of Pozieres to be recognised in the Australian story of the First World War on the Western Front, dominated as it was by, understandably, some of those key actions in 1918, like Villers-Bret, Le Hamel, and the Battle of Amiens, the breaking of the Hindenburg Line. But Pozieres is all part of that journey that the men of the Australian Imperial Force took as they fought their way and learned their way across these battlefields and became that unit that would be very much the tip of the spear in those final battles of the last year of the Great War. Returning to the main Albert-Bapaume road and walking further up into the village, Pozieres, like all those Somme villages, completely destroyed in the battles, not just of 1916 but 18 as well, pulverised in 16, reduced to dust in 1918. It rose like a phoenix from those ashes and was rebuilt. So nothing that we see in this village, although there are many dilapidated looking houses here, but nothing that we see predates the First World War. It's all from the 1920s or later. And one of the buildings as we go up this bit of road on the right hand side is the famous, infamous Le Tommy Cafe. Now, I've been coming to that cafe for many years, since the very first visits that I made to the Somme in the early 1980s. It was the Burma Star Cafe in those days, run by the Brie family. They had a small private museum at the back, loads of photographs all over the wall. And then eventually in the 90s, Dominique Zanardi, who had been the founder and first curator of the Musée des Abris in Albert, the museum beneath the town of Albert, then purchased this cafe from the Bries and opened it up as Le Tommy, and it's been Le Tommy ever since. A staggering private museum of artefacts inside, a trench out in the garden with reconstructions and lots of original kit in it, and huge amounts of safe ordnance lined up, empty shrapnel shell cases, for example, to give you a bit of an insight into the scale of the bombardments that took place in places like Pozieres during the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And the walls still covered in photographs and lots of material relating to the Australians, the diggers who fought at Pozieres in July through to September of 1916. I've known Dominique Zanardi, again, since the very early days of coming to the Somme. He had his own little private museum in his parents' house in Bécourt. He set up a small little museum near to one of the supermarkets in Albert back in the 1980s, then became the curator of the museum, the main museum, And he's continued on ever since. And, all these decades later, he's still doing this. He's still got this incredible collection of Great War material. And most people have no idea what Dominic has done over the years for remembrance, to help recover the bodies of soldiers from the First World War, lost on the Somme, recovered by local farmers who didn't really know what to do with them. Dominic stepped in and made sure that the commission were notified and the authorities came and those bodies were recovered. And he's done many, many other things besides. He's a great bloke and someone who I'm always pleased to see whenever I go there. And I went to see him last week during that anniversary period of the Battle of the Somme. And one of the things that he's got in the museum at the moment, it's expanded in the last year or so, because a few small private museums have recently closed and Dominic has bought some of their prize items. So he must have the world's biggest collection of trench mortars now, from British examples and French examples, including some very rare ones like a catapult trench mortar weapon, through to Minenwerfers of all sizes, right up to the very big ones. And again, these are weapons of war, but they give us an insight into what the fighting on the Western Front was like. And it's well worth going in there for a drink, for a meal, to look at the collection, to go out into the trench and just chat to Dominic. There's always something going on the Somme, and if there's one person who knows, it's Dominic Zanardi. He's one of those characters of the Somme, really, which sadly have many of them faded away over the years. And that leads me on to continue past the Tommy, turn left onto the road that takes you up to Thiepval, and go past the school in Pozieres up to a house which for many, many years was very much part of my life, number 84. And even Christian Foucault used to live here. I was put onto them, I'm pretty sure, by Tom Fairgrieve at Delville Wood. He was the Scottish caretaker of Delville Wood and the Memorial and eventually the museum there. And Tom himself was one of those great characters of the Somme who sadly faded away last winter. But he put me on to Eve and Christian, and I went to visit them. And you could not meet two nicer people. They lived in a very simple home. They were an elderly couple. I discovered that their son had died when he was only a teenager in a motorbike accident. They'd had a lot of tragedy in their life, but they were generous of spirit, and you were always, always welcome there. The garden was full of First World War material. Eve had the front room turned into his own private museum with some absolutely incredible artefacts that he'd found over the years. And Eve had worked as a Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Imperial War Graves Commission gardener. After he'd done his national service just after World War II, he joined the Imperial War Graves Commission in 1947. He'd worked at London Cemetery at High Wood, buried the dead from the Second World War who were moved in there during that period. Many of the First World War graves still had wooden crosses on, and he'd been part of the team that had replaced those with headstones. Then he'd worked at Corby, at Peak Wood Cemetery for a long period of time, at Gordon Dump Cemetery near to La Boisselle, and then eventually at Pozieres British Cemetery and Memorial. And there's a little room in the corner of that site, which was the gardener's room, where I often used to see him on some of my visits in those early years. But it would always be followed up with a visit to this house here to have a cup of coffee with them, have a beer, have a chat. Eve always gave a little souvenir. Whenever you left, you never left empty-handed. He always gave you a little souvenir to take away with you. But his knowledge of those battlefields was incredible, and I learned so much from him. And when I moved to Courcelette back in the 1990s, him and Christian were amongst the first people who came round to see us, and they became very good friends on a different kind of level to me and also to my family, and helped us absolutely no end during those early years, and I will always, always be grateful for that. Sadly, Eve died suddenly in 1997, left a big gap in our lives, but someone that I'll always remember. There's a field just outside Pozieres where I last saw him, and that's every time I pass it, and I passed it last week, I always think of him there walking across that field, looking, reading that landscape really, looking for something to add to his museum, some new story to tell. And a lot of his collection got dispersed, sadly, but Christiane carried on, and she carried on helping people who visited the battlefields. Many young Australians would turn up at her door and she'd sit them down and give them a drink and help them out. She was a wonderful, wonderful lady, and sadly, since we all first walked together along this road and I first told you about her and Eve, Christiane passed away in 2023, and another chapter of Somme history closed. This is one of the things I think that I miss when I go back to places like the Somme. In those early years, I came to understand how important it was to get to know the local people on this landscape. They could open doors that no one else could. They could tell you things about that landscape that no one else knew. And it gave me knowledge and experience and understanding that I couldn't have gained in any other kind of way. And that generation who had experienced the occupation in the Second World War, who had ancestors who remembered the Great War and even the Franco-Prussian War, they have sadly faded away. And these characters, as I call them, of the Somme, are almost all gone now. And that's a sad, sad chapter of Somme history that's closed. Continuing past their house up towards the far end of Pozieres village to the north, we come out to the civilian cemetery. And if you ever come up this way, go into the civilian cemetery. There's no war graves in here, but Eve and Christiane are buried in there. You'll find their grave quite easily. There are photographs of them on the grave, and often there are poppy crosses put on there by some of the many, many friends who used to visit them year after year after year. And standing there, you're right on that northern part of the battlefield. In the cemetery, you're in a slightly elevated position. You can look back towards Overlers and Mash Valley and Albert beyond. It's a bit obscured by the new plantation of a wood, which was in its genesis when we first made the recording doing this walk in 2020. It's expanded greatly since then, all part of that ever-changing landscape. But this was an area of very intensive fighting, and there are some quite gruesome accounts of Australian soldiers fighting their way through the ruins of the original cemetery that was here, where the shell fire had thrown the coffins up out of their graves. There were skeletons scattered everywhere, and that, with the kind of mayhem of the artillery and the sound of battle, caused a lot of men to break under the pressure of the fighting, the intense fighting that took place during the capture and the consolidation and the holding of Pozieres in July of 1916. And crossing the road, a track goes off across the fields. If you followed it, you go back towards Courcelette. Another one goes off to the right towards a position called the Elbow, and over there were what was called the OG lines, the old German lines, two massive German systems of defences, which the next phase of the Australian battle, that's where it took them in July through to August, particularly on the 4th of August 1916. The Australians attacked there around the site of the Pozieres windmill, the highest point on the 1916 battlefield, where you'll find the memorial to the tanks who formed up with the Canadians to attack Courcelette village, and opposite the memorial to the 2nd Australian Division and the mound of where that Pozieres windmill site was located, all that remains of that feature of that original part of the Somme battlefield, and a big memorial park behind it now with some perhaps less attractive memorials to the animals, but also memorials to the Australian missing of Pozieres. And in that field there, in the 1990s, Russell Basisto was found there. He was a young Australian soldier from South Australia who was found in the bottom of a shell hole, lying on his back with his Lee Enfield rifle still in his hand. Big, thick aluminium identity disc, which the Australians had, and he was found by a local farmer who lived in Courcelette, declared to the authorities and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, as was the practice, and identified through this identity disc, and was reburied at Courcelette British Cemetery in 1998. And the 27th Battalion AIF that he came from still exists as the 27th Battalion in the Australian Army, and men from that unit carried him in a coffin to his grave. And an Australian padre gave a talk on mateship, that kind of central ethos of what the Australians were all about. And this ground too, as we look across those fields towards that next village of Courcelette, is where Albert Jacka was in 1916. Jacka, the first Australian to be awarded the Victoria Cross at Gallipoli in 1915, was commissioned and then spent much of the rest of the war fighting his own kind of private war against the Germans into what became known as Jacka's Mob. And the book of that title by Lieutenant Rule is a classic Great War account, and one that's highly, highly recommended. Jack needs his own podcast, and one day I will do that, because he is one of those heroes of the Great War, a man who fought hard, a man who always looked to the welfare of his mates and thought of those around him, and a man who carried that fight to the enemy time and time again and paid the price, dying in his father's arms just a short few years after the Great War, still relatively a young man. So many stories here at Pozieres, not just with the Australians, but many other regiments and units besides. We can stand as we come out of the village, look past the hangars that are there now, down towards Overlers, and you're looking to the ground where Charles Carrington was with the Royal Warwickshire Regiment in July of 1916, and you can reference his account of that in his memoirs of the Great War. Everywhere you look here, every field, every corner, every tree, every turn in the lane, there's a story, and that is, I guess, the beauty of this landscape of the Somme. Coming up to the next farm we can see on the right-hand side out in the fields, that is Ferme de Mouquet, Mouquet Farm, Mouquet Farm, Mouquet Farm. I mean, it's got so many different names. And this was a central part of the northern Australian sector on the Somme. It was attacked by Australian troops after the capture of Pozieres village. Wave after wave of Australian attack went forward to try and take it. Often they took it, but the ruins of it were riddled with tunnels, and the Germans would pop up behind, and the attacks were thrown back by German counterattacks, toing and froing until the Australians handed over to the Canadians. The Canadians went in with different units holding the line there, and then the Canadian Mounted Rifles made an assault on the farm on the 15th September 1916 with mixed results. It was still inconclusive, still in German hands, and eventually it fell to men of the 11th Northern Division, veterans of Gallipoli who'd fought at Gallipoli in 1915 and were now on the Western Front. And we did a special episode of the podcast looking at their story and the capture of the farm in one of our previous episodes. When you stand here today, there's an Australian memorial that was given to the Australians, the ground it sits on, by the Mayor of Courcelette, Monsieur Gons, back in the 1990s, that commemorates the memorial there, the Australians who fell at Mouquet Farm in 1916. Around the quarry we can see signs of shell holes, a bit of accidentally preserved battlefield area, and the farm always looks a bit dilapidated. It is a working farm. It, in the 1990s, was one of those sites that potentially could have become the Australian memorial sites, the visitor centre that the Australians were planning to build on the Western Front battlefields, which eventually became the Monash Centre at Villers-Bretonneux. But one of the locations that was looked at as an alternative was Mouquet Farm. But Monsieur Gons, the mayor who'd given that ground for the memorial at Mouquet Farm, sadly died in 1999, and that somewhat complicated the accession of the ground here, so it never happened. It's not an accessible farm. It's not an accessible site. It is a working farm. We've got to respect that. But the bit of ground opposite the new farm, in inverted commas, was where the old farm was once located, and that is ground where we can clearly see the undulations of shell holes. There's bits of concrete sticking out of that field as well. And beneath that site, I know very well, there are these massive, massive cellars that were part of the original farm, with no doubt the tunnels that linked them all up from the German perspective still intact. This was that German headquarters before the Battle of the Somme that linked towards Thiepval and the units there, Overlers, and down towards La Boisselle, and it remained a pivotal part of the Somme battle throughout 1916. Now, back in that original episode, this is kind of where we ended our journey at Mouquet Farm. We looked across the fields, the Thiepval Memorial was on the skyline in the distance, and we spoke about visiting that another day, and it was another story. And 6 years later and 300 episodes, we still haven't done a proper episode on Thiepval, something I kind of really need to remedy this year with the anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. But we're going to end this one slightly differently by going up to Thiepval to have an initial think and kind of look at the Thiepval Memorial, because it is one of, if not the most important British memorial of the First World War. It's the largest in terms of its size. It commemorates more soldiers than any other memorial to the missing, more than 72,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who were missing on the Somme, and that phrase, the missing of the Somme, is central to its identity. And as we've said at Pozieres, the missing of the Great War, they're one of the cruelest elements of that conflict, really, because with a missing soldier, there was always that hope he might one day return, that he was in a camp somewhere, he was in a German hospital having lost his memory, who knows? But the sad reality is that those 72,000 men who were named here in stone on the panels of the Thiepval Memorial, they were never coming home. And the thousands who came here when the memorial was unveiled in 1932, in those final years before the Second World War, hopefully they had some degree of closure when they saw those names on the vast panels of this memorial to the missing. And when we come here, it's kind of overwhelming. It is an empire memorial. It speaks of empire, designed by Edwin Lutyens. It's a typical Lutyens structure with red brick and white Portland stone. This massive archway that was perhaps going to be built at Saint-Quentin originally, or possibly astride the Albert Bapaume Road at Pozieres. One of the interwar Imperial War Graves Commission maps shows a Ancre Heights memorial being located in that area. But because by the 1920s, moving towards the 30s, the French were kind of getting fed up with all these memorials that were being built, given that they appeared to be getting bigger and bigger and required more and more land, a change in policy resulted in sites being chosen that had existing cemeteries. And this ground here at Thiepval was chosen because the family that had once owned a chateau here in Thiepval, which is not where the memorial is today. Many people believe that's where the chateau was located. It was a little bit further away on the other side of the village, near to a modern farm now, on the ridge overlooking Thiepval Wood. And the family who'd lived there died during the Great War, never returned. The chateau was never rebuilt, and all the people that worked for the chateau estate never returned. So the land here could be claimed by the French state and given to the British for this memorial, which is kind of a shortened version of how this memorial came into being. And the commission, the Imperial War Graves Commission, then came up with the very good idea of making an Anglo-French site to commemorate the Anglo-French sacrifice on the Somme, with an inscription on the memorial in French referencing this, and the Anglo-French cemetery with 300 French graves and 300 British graves, marking the joint sacrifice of both nations in 1916. But as I say, when you go up to the memorial, you walk across that big green expanse towards it, then go up the mighty steps and stand near the Stone of Remembrance and look around the panels and see the almost endless list of names. I mean, there's every rank from private to lieutenant colonel on here. There are the humblest, from the humblest homes and streets through to the aristocracy. There are men decorated with every decoration and medal issued by Britain and many of its allies, the military medal right through to the Victoria Cross. There are men on here who their loss resulted in families donating land to the nation, which is now in the care of the National Trust. Familial lines ended with the deaths of many of the men on here, surnames that don't exist anymore because this was the last male member of that family, and with his death, that family name did not continue. So it's a place to pause and reflect when you wander amongst these names. And again, over the years of researching the Great War, of rescuing Great War artifacts, from photographs to letters to identity discs to medals and plaques, there's so many men that I have connections to on this memorial, and it's good to seek them out and touch their names in stone and stand beneath their panels, and also stand on the memorial and look out across the valley towards Thiepval Wood and beyond to the Ancre Valley as well. This rolling landscape of the Somme. From there, it's very, very apparent that you are not, as many people believe, the Somme is not a billiard table, and you can see that from the Thiepval Memorial. And it's a place, when I go to the Sussex names and I see Second Lieutenant Dugan, the officer who joined at the same time as Edmund Blunden in the 11th Royal Sussex and then was killed in the fighting around Stuff Redoubts. There's so many names on here, so many stories, those criss-cross pathways of the Great War, all those things that bring us back to these places, and will again and again to walk always along that old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.